1880 when he writes this. It's a spiritual drama of moral struggles concerning faith, doubt, reason, and modern Russia, back in the late 1800s. It produced this line from the character Ivan Karamazov. If God doesn't exist, then everything is permissible. And so in that regard, Dostoevsky is saying, well, you sort of need this ultimate scorekeeper. And without that, then anyone can do anything they want because there is no moral foundation. There is no ultimate arbiter. There's no ultimate judge. It just becomes, whichever group is the strongest can dominate whichever group is the weakest and impose their will on them. Whatever society decides what's right for them, that must be right because they all voted and decided that way. And there's a lot of immoral things that seem preferable to a lot of people, but just because it's preferable to the majority of the people just doesn't mean that it's right for all the people or right for any of the people. It really doesn't make any sense, but that's the perception. So both religious and secular critics of the divine command theory believe that it poses a serious dilemma, and the dilemma was first articulated by Socrates. And you have this at the end of the PDF text, they printed out a little bit here. You have at the end what's called the Euthyphro dilemma. It's written by Plato in 380 BC. It's a dialogue between Euthyphro and Socrates, and then Plato writes to tell about it. So the dialogue poses the following dilemma: is what is morally good commanded by God because it is morally good, or is it morally good because it is commanded by God? Just to repeat that again, right? So the first sort of step in this dilemma, or this kind of paradox, so to speak, is the question: is what is morally good, that thing that you're saying is morally good, well, is it good because it was commanded by God, because it is morally good, or is it morally good because it is commanded by God? It sounds like you're trying to have it both ways there. So say that if an action is right or wrong because God wills it, God commanded it so. It's right if right or wrong are dependent on God, then many heinous crimes and evil actions would be right if God willed them, right? So in other words, if you're saying that the first leg is what is morally good commanded by God because it is morally good, or second, is it morally good because it's commanded by God? Well, then if God willed, that means that God, that's arbitrary, it's purely arbitrary. It leaves God open to being just capricious or arbitrary. God just said, I'll just say certain things are right, certain things are wrong. But then a critic might say, well, what if God willed that murder, theft, or torture, these are morally right? If God has unlimited power, he could easily will such actions, and if the rightness of an action depended on God's will alone, he could not have reasons for willing what he wills. Well, no reasons would be available, and none required. In other words, God can do anything he wants. So why doesn't he just will this or will that? So it seems like morality is just based on a God who just arbitrarily chose that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Just completely arbitrary. But then the second phrase of the dilemma, if God wills an action because it is morally right, which was the first thing that we stated, if God wills an action because it is morally right, if moral norms are independent from God, then the divine command theory must be false. So the second one, in essence, of being arbitrary, just because if God commanded it to be so, that's only because God is just acting arbitrarily. It's not because it is actually right or wrong. It's just God arbitrarily chose this over that, right? So you have to listen, because this is what a lot of the critics will say of this theory. And I'm not saying it's a good theory. It probably isn't. Most likely isn't. However, then, if you want to have it the other way, and you say, okay, God is either arbitrary or God is dependent on some independent morality that he employs, which means that the morality didn't in fact come from him. It's that God just says that this is morally right or morally wrong because of some pre-existing moral condition that God is using. And in that case, God can't be all-powerful, God can't be all-knowing, God can't be independent. God is in fact independent from some external moral standards to himself. And this is how critics would take apart divine command theory. And I would say rightly so, because none of those things are true. Morality is not independent from God, nor is God arbitrary in his selection of morality. And so without going into some of the other, Gottfried Leibniz, you can look at this and such, I would just say that the divine command theory, no, it doesn't hold, although it sounds good, right? God says this, God says that. But it doesn't hold, because morality comes from the essential nature of God. Morality is a byproduct of God's nature. Things are right and wrong because of the purity of God's nature. Morality is grounded in the essence of God's nature. Therefore, you have these norms, and therefore you have these principles because they flow from God's nature. And God is not arbitrary in his nature, nor does God exist independent of some external moral standard, for all morality comes from his essential nature. So anyway, a lot of ground to cover here, and we've just sort of getting our feet wet, so to speak, in session 1. We'll have 2 more on meta-ethics, which is going to come from Vaughn. So stay tuned. Stay tuned. Can't talk. I've been talking too long. We'll be back with you shortly. Blessings.